Get your ears wrapped around the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast. All the scoop you need to know, from college basketball to the NBA and even March Madness. News of your rising stars, topics on and off the hardwood. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast.
Into the GSMC Basketball Podcast right here on the GSMC Podcast Network. It is your host, Brice Lewis, back at it again to discuss all things basketball with you across the landscape of ball, the b-ball world, I like to call it. You know what we do. So, today's show, we actually, I haven't done this as much in terms of my previous shows to now. But we're going to get into some discussions, obviously. I'm going to start this show off with some discussion topic in terms of giving my opinion on certain things. You know, maybe some people may consider this the basics of basketball, but things that what I think and how important I think this is. We're going to talk about the stars. We're going to talk about your stars. You know, we're going to talk about star players, how important a star player is depending on the way the team is shaped. And we're also going to talk about the bench, why you always hear it when it comes to playoff time. Even though you may not play your entire bench, depending on the team, those 3-4 guys that you do allow to play off the bench, how important they are. Because we've seen in the past, teams that's top heavy have no bench, and now it's a struggle to get past the really good teams that do get more bench production. We're going to discuss that on the first half of the show. And then the second half of the show, we're going to get into some NBA news and topics. So we're going to get into all that today on the podcast. Thank you for tuning in once again. Really, really appreciate you guys. Let me be part of your day. And let's go ahead and jump right into it. So, I'm going to pose this. How important is a star player? Like, we know star players are needed to win championships. We know this. We know that star players are needed and can be the difference between you getting over the hump and not. But there are some teams with stars that never win. Some people wonder why. Some people even question if that even makes them a legitimate star. Especially in today's basketball, how we feel like a ring is what validates you as a player. Instead of your body of work, the grind, the effort, the attention to detail, everything that you have left out there on the court. If you're not coming out of there with a chip, it feels like it's hard for you to be even considered great. Top 10 even in a position. And to me, I think that that's very interesting to look at. Because stars come in different ways. There's different types of stars. If you remember Magic Johnson was known for his passing, his playmaking ability. That's what made the Showtime Lakers Showtime. Even though he could score, he was not known as a guy who would come in and drop 30 a night. Even though we knew he could. Because remember, a lot of stars always may have had the ability to do something great, but they never did it to that level because that was not what was needed of them on that particular team. As a star, sometimes you have to make adjustments. If you think about LeBron James, what's one thing we know him for outside of his ability to score? He is one of the most elite passers, some people think, since Magic Johnson. That's why when you play with LeBron and LeBron's on teams, as a teammate, you're going to get your shots. You're going to get opportunities to make plays because LeBron is going to put you in situations where you can make plays. And so that's why when you play with LeBron, it's a little different. Where think about playing with a guy like James Harden. Now, he can make plays for teammates, but what do we know James Harden for? We know him for scoring because the way they've shaped the team, James Harden has to drop 30, 40 a game, and then everybody else has to give them just enough, especially from the Houston Rockets the last couple of years, from three-point shooting and whenever they can get baskets in the paint. You see, those are two different types of stars because they have two different types of roles. One's won a championship, one hasn't. James Harden has a harder path because of the way they play than LeBron does. But also having AD this year is one thing that helps him, because now when he didn't have AD, it was kind of on LeBron to score more, to do more from a scoring perspective, because he didn't really have that guy with the Lakers the first year where he could say, I know if I have 30, I have someone who can also give me 30. I could get 20 from Kuzma, maybe from Ingram. Lonzo's up and down. It's inconsistency where Anthony Davis, he can give me 25 to 30 a night for sure. And yeah, you have an off night. Everybody has an off night. But you always kind of knew who could give you what and when they could give it to you. That's what sometimes separated the players, the great players, from the decent players. And so from a star perspective, if you think about the Kawhi Leonard situation in Toronto has always had a very well-built team. Always very well-constructed. Had a bench. Had good starting players. Made the playoffs. Top 4 seed. Number 1 seed even. But they couldn't get over the hump when they went against a true, legitimate superstar and considered one of the best players, if not the best player in the league, in LeBron James. Now, when Kawhi got there, LeBron left. So that wasn't in their way. But they still had to go through a star like Giannis and Joel Embiid and them. When you have such construction like Toronto had, you had such construction. And with that construction, and I guess trying to collect my thoughts, my point with Kawhi is Kawhi gave them that boost, that extra bit of scoring, that extra bit of clutchness, that extra bit of playmaking, that extra bit of defense that was able to get them over the top. Now, we can sit here and talk about Golden State was injured. Kevin Durant wasn't playing. Klay got hurt. Giannis, we see his game, everything now. But at the end of the day, if Kawhi Leonard didn't go to the Raptors and they were playing the Bucks, do you think the Raptors would have beaten the Bucks without a Kawhi Leonard? Because one of the main reasons why they were able to do what they did to Giannis is because of Kawhi Leonard. So if you didn't have him there, what would the team look like? What would the team be? That would be the big, major question. And so that's why, to me, in my honest opinion, I look at the situation, I look at everything, and I kind of think to myself that a star is defined based off his role on the team, which can then elevate a player or players around him. Because think about Carmelo in Denver. We knew Carmelo was a star in Denver, but again, he was known as a scorer. Carmelo wasn't known as the greatest defender, even though he could defend. He was known as a scorer. But who kept beating the Nuggets of that time year after year? The Lakers. They couldn't get past Kobe and the Lakers. They couldn't get past San Antonio. And obviously San Antonio is an anomaly because they had stars, but the system they ran allowed it to work, where it's like the Spurs system was, we have 3 stars, but they all equally give to the team. It's not like, okay, Kawhi gives this much on the Raptors, then Siakam, then Lowry, then Fran Fleet, and everybody has their levels. And so if Kawhi plays at the level he plays at, Toronto always has a chance. It was, even if Duncan didn't play the greatest, Ginobili and Parker could still ball out. If Ginobili didn't play well, Parker and Duncan. And so it kind of everybody gave the same energy towards the situation, which allowed them to be so effective, which is why they won so many championships. And so a star to me is a guy who based off his skill set, based off what he could do, and based off how you shape the team around him, can dictate if he can be the difference between winning a championship or just winning, which is just you win a lot of games, make playoff appearances, but never reach that game that you've been aiming for. And so on and so forth. I think that's where the questions, come in. That's why we question guys like a Russell Westbrook, because triple-double machine can average 25, 30 points if he has to. But when he is asked in the playoffs to do that and win, he comes up short. Because the flaw with the Thunder teams when Russell was the only player was it was all dependent upon him. So if Russell didn't have a good game, more than likely the other players were not going to be enough to get him over the top, which will go into my next conversation with the bench in the next segment. But on the stars, that's why James Harden. It's funny because if Chris Paul never got hurt, we would have assumed James Harden would have made it to the finals. Now, what they wanted, we don't know. Cavaliers were not a great team that year, but we don't know. The conversation might be different in terms of James Harden right now. But we'll never know because that never happened. Chris Paul got hurt, and you know what happened. And so for me, knowing that, hearing that, seeing that, I feel like a star player especially is so prudent in today's NBA. It's like there's different levels of star. There's LeBron stars. There's all stars, like a Kyle Lowry. Like they're a very good player. Like they're not a superstar, but they're not just some normal, decent starter. They're a really good player, so you kind of have them in that between a good starter and then a superstar. You just have them right there, and you just call them all stars. You can win with all stars, but the NBA has changed where since everybody has superstars, they're always going to have that higher level of star to overcome your stars. Remember, back in the day, Detroit, Chauncey Billups was a really good player. Rip Hamilton, really good player. Ben Wallace, really good player. But they were never considered superstars. They were all-star type players. And then it was Shaq and Kobe. That was one of the first, that's one of the times that we said a bunch of stars beat superstars. Because of the NBA, the way NBA was played. Now, I think in today's NBA, it's very hard to just have a bunch of stars, but now have superstars and win. It's extremely difficult. But it's going to win you games. It's going to get you to playoffs, and you never know. If things go your way, you never know what could potentially come out of that. But so, to me, a star is extremely important depending on the situation, depending on what you're asking, depending on how the team is shaped, depending on how everything is put together. To me, that's that is kind of the big thing with stars. So first, I don't feel like we need to validate stars on rings because listen, the NBA is 30 teams. There's a chance you may never win a ring and be a great player. You just may have just never been on that team that was destined to win that year, and that's okay because as long as you still were the best at what you did and did what you had to do, you will always be considered great in my book. But that's all the time we have here for this segment. Coming up next, we're going to get into the bench. How important the bench is, the role players, the 3-and-D guys, all that right here and more on the podcast.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment we discussed stars. How important are stars? Let's talk about star players. The different kind of stars, all the things that go into being a star player, the different levels, everything. You know, just like I say, a good discussion point, good little topic right there to get into right there, and how basically we've had different stars throughout the years, and everybody has different impacts, and what makes a star, and maybe an all-star, and things like that. So that's what we talked about last segment. This segment, we're going to get into the bench, aka role players. The bench, how important the bench is. Because the bench is extremely important to any NBA team, if you know. You know, the bench, I think the bench could honestly be what breaks a team, and also be what helps a team get over the proverbial mountain. Because I feel like through the years of basketball, throughout history, you have seen the importance of a bench. You've seen those players who always come off the bench, but they're the ones finishing games. You've seen where the bench could be the difference between you having just enough to give your starters a chance to take over. You know, there are a lot of things that come from the bench. The bench really can set the tone for a team. Remember something. People forget this. When Golden State started winning championships, they were about a 10-deep team. Their bench was huge in them winning. They got to 73 wins with a great bench, with no KD. Because literally, the Golden State bench was almost like a second starting lineup. They really had the best bench in all of the NBA. And so when you have the firepower they had with Steph and Clay, and then knowing your bench could come in and give you 40, 50 a night, that's half of 100. Their bench could do that. They could give them between 30 and 40, maybe even 50 a night. And then you had Steph and Clay both getting 25 and 20. And then literally everybody else just has to do their part, give you pitch in here, pitch in there. You're going to be in a lot of games, and you're probably going to win a lot of games. You've seen it with the Washington Wizards when they had John Wall, Bradley Beal, Nene, Gortat. They were a top-heavy team. They didn't have a consistent bench. The bench would sometimes give them duds, which is why they couldn't score enough. You see it with Boston this year. Outside of Marcus Smart, they really didn't have that much of a bench. It was top heavy. It was on Tatum. It was on Walker. And you could sit here and say, well, that's 5 players. That may be enough people to be successful. But if you understand, it may be good enough to get you to a certain part or to get you to a certain point in the playoffs. But if you truly know the game, when you go against the elite teams, you need to make sure you have enough support. That's why the Lakers, to me, won the chip. Because Anthony and LeBron James are going to do what they do. But when Rondo started hitting threes and giving him almost 10 plus a game, and then you got Markieff Morris giving him 8 or 10 here, then you got Kuzma giving him 8 or 10 there. Now you may have 30, 35 points between those 3 players off the bench. Then you got AD getting 30, LeBron getting close to 30, KCP, a role player in the starting lineup, giving him 12, 15 off threes. And then you see how it all kind of adds up, and then boom, wins. Because the bench, to me, I think one of the keys, is the bench. Because I think this is an issue I think I see with a lot of young teams. You know, especially like Minnesota, who have 2 stars that are young, is that they have young players who can play, who are stars. But then you get to the bench, and then the bench doesn't give them a lot. You can always tell by a team's bench unit how good they really are. To me. Because that's why I think that was one of the main reasons why people sat here and said the Clippers were going to win it all. Because they had a bench. You had Reggie Jackson coming off the bench. You had Lou Williams and Montrezl Harrell, 2 people who were in the 6-man competition. 2 guys who probably could start coming off the bench. You had a lot of depth. Marcus Morris. That's a pretty good bench. That's why people thought they had enough, because they had so many people who could all do something. The Lakers had a bench too. Their bench was different because it helped them play in different styles. JaVale McGee didn't have to give them points. Dwight Howard didn't have to score a lot for them to be successful. But they could play many different ways with the players, and every player they brought into the game could make an impact in their own way. Because sometimes we like to justify a good bench by scoring. Does the bench score? Are they scoring points? And sometimes I feel like you can't justify it like that. You have to look at it from a perspective of, if you had to play big, do you have big men? If you had to play small, do you have enough depth to play small? If you had to play a more of a shooting game, do you have shooters? That, to me, is one of the strategistic and systematic things in the game that can make the difference between you winning and losing. And so on and so forth. I think that, again, that is one of the reasons why the Lakers won. Because they could play big when they needed to. They could play small when they needed to. You got to have that flexibility. See, Houston, when you committed to that small ball, you didn't have any other options. You didn't have the options on the bench. They had Tyson Chandler, but really at this point in Tyson Chandler's career, how effective can he be? And so they only had one way to play. And Mike D'Antoni has always been known as a coach who only plays one way. So once that one way is not being as effective, it's like they have no options. And this league is about adjustments. That has been something that has been preached and said for the longest time. This league is about adjustments. If you want to win in this league, you got to be able to adjust when needed. And so, with that being known, some teams don't make the adjustments, which is why they struggle. Because they're not making adjustments that they need. They're not making adjustments that is needed. And that's why they can never get over the hump. The Clippers, you saw with their matchup against Denver this year. They may have all this offensive firepower, but what if the players aren't shooting well? If guys are struggling, not having their shot? Can you play a different way to win? And yeah, they were up in all those games, but it all came back to bite them because you saw the Joker was able to have his way. They had nobody who could play big with him outside of Zubac, but Zubac can't keep up. Where the Lakers, they could play big because of that. And that's why they were able to give Joker a tougher matchup. And you really, and I think that's why to me, if I'm a coach and I formulate my bench, I formulate it based on, okay, who might we have to get through if we have these type of aspiration, championship aspirations? What type of way do we have to play to beat these teams? And you don't really do that sometimes with your starting lineup, depending on who you have. You do that with your bench. You do that with your role players. You do that with everybody else to at least be able to affect the game in that way. Because usually a great star is able to change and adapt. You know, if we're playing a quicker, fast pace, they can play a quicker, fast pace. If they need to play slow, they play slow. That's what makes LeBron so great. Steph Curry, KD. Yes, everybody has a more effective way of playing. But at the same time, you can play different styles if needed. If that's what it is called on or called upon for you to win. And so that to me is what can make the difference in a team. When you have teams where you don't have a bench, like I said with Boston, no bench. So if Tatum and Brown are struggling, either Marcus Smart, Gordon Hayward, and Kemba Walker got to step up and maybe go above their averages of what they do on a game-to-game basis. But if they don't, you don't have much else. What if again, in matchups, again, team isn't really good in the front court. You have a guy who can dominate a little bit more in the front court. That's important. Why do you think you play against a team like Houston? Again, back to the Lakers because they're a great example of this. They played Houston. Small ball. Okay. Now remember, if they didn't have the depth and the players they had, they may have not been able to play small ball because they may feel like, okay, we have to play some of our players that we don't want to play or don't really play a lot because we have to adjust, which could affect our performance. But everybody that they played all played. When they played the Houston Rockets, they said, okay, Dwight Howard, JaVale McGee, we can't play you. We're going to put AD at the 5. But we got Kuzma, who can play in the small ball. We got Caruso, KCP, Danny Green. You got guys who was like, okay, we can adjust to this. We can make something out of this. And I think that, to me, is what is the best, or the difference. That's why the Heat were so good. The Heat don't have that one guy, unless you consider Jimmy Butler that way. But the thing is you saw their depth, their role. They had so much around them. They could play a great style of basketball and be successful. Now, they weren't the biggest team, and you saw that. But at the same time, they were decent. It was just like they had Bam, but it was like, we don't have 3-4 guys we can maybe say we can put at you instead of maybe 1 or 2. But their bench was one of the biggest reasons why they were able to get to the finals, why they were able to compete in the finals, because, you know, especially if you don't have that guy, sometimes you got to make sure that your support players can get you enough support. In Miami's bench was new. None had to play minutes. He was able to give them support. Tyler Hero eventually moved into the starting lineup, but he came off the bench. You saw what he did. Dragic came off the bench. You saw what he did. So you know their bench was crucial in their success. Kelly Olynyk. You saw their bench was one of the best benches in the league, and then with combining with what the starters could do, that's what got them over the top. That's what got them being able to beat teams, because it was like you would look at their stat line, but you look at Miami's stat line and see 20 here, 19 here, 18 here, 14 here, 12 here, 10 here. That adds up. It adds up. You got 8 players potentially scoring 10 plus points. That adds up. And so when you have that kind of depth, it can be the difference with me in terms of you winning and losing. Like, really, it can be the big difference between you winning or losing a game. Because if you don't have that, and let's say you're in a very high-scoring affair, yeah, the starter's going to score, but sometimes if you just had that one guy off the bench who could just give you a little bit more, that sometimes might be the difference between you winning and losing a game. And that's why it's extremely important to reach that pinnacle and to reach the depth. That's why depth is so important. That's why I think Denver is a team that's always very competitive year after year. Why they do so well in the regular season, because they have depth. They have players who can beat you coming off the bench. And I think sometimes that is what helped them in those situations, knowing they have multiple guys that can play big if they needed them to. And it's not like they're having to play a player that we haven't really even seen a lot of, or they don't know if they can trust in certain situations. But that's all the time we have here for this segment. Coming up next, we're going to now get into the front office / coaching staff and how important that is to the overall dynamic of a franchise and a team. So stay tuned for that right here on the GSMC Basketball Podcast.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment we discussed the bench unit, the role players, how important they play in terms of the dynamic of a franchise, how I think the bench could honestly be what makes or breaks a team, because that's where you, to me, really create the kind of team you want. You can create the type of styles you want to play. Like, if you're a team that plays fast, you're going to have a bunch of players on the bench who can also play fast when they come in. If you want to play slow, you're going to have a bunch of players on the bench who can play slow. You wouldn't get players who can't play a certain type of style, or else it wouldn't work. Or you can get a team that can play multiple styles. So, and that's usually the key, because you saw that with the Lakers this year and why they were able to come away with the championship, because of the fact they were able to play multiple styles. And so the bench, to me, is a very crucial part. But before I get into the coach and front office, I just want to remind you guys, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at GSMC_basketball to keep up with all of our latest updates on basketball things, as we love to interact with you over there on Twitter. But now, we going to get into the coaching and the front office. Now this group right here, you know, some people have undervalued it. Some people think it's very valuable. Sometimes people feel like when you have stars, how important is coaching? You know, people talk about Golden State when they lost Steve Kerr for a couple of playoffs, and how the new coaches came in there and they played just fine. And so people thought, oh, well, then Steve Kerr maybe is not really needed for the Golden State to be good. And then yet you see teams like the Raptors and how Nick Nurse gets the most out of his guys, and now you can legitimately say he's one of the reasons why Toronto is what they are. And there's just so many different, you know, perspectives on the coaching and front office, you know, because the coach, to me, I think the coach's impact is determined by the team that he is coaching. Of course, if you were able to have the Eastern or Western All-Star team, it probably wouldn't matter as much who the coach is. Honestly. Because, you know, well, we just have so much talent, you know, unless we just completely don't know how to play basketball anymore, we'll be fine. But think about the teams like young teams. Like, think about the younger teams in the league and young teams we've seen throughout the years. Coaching, you would figure, is more important for them because of developing. You're trying to help them improve day by day, week by week, month by month, so they can be better players. And so, how important is coaching? You know, when we think about Phil Jackson, he's won, I believe, almost, or I think he did win 10 championships. He won with the Bulls, with Michael Jordan. He won with Kobe and the Lakers. You know. And the thing about it, in that situation, if you think about it, Phil Jackson really doesn't get the credit, I feel like, with the Bulls as he does with the Lakers. Lakers, yeah, Kobe, yeah, Shaq, but Phil Jackson. Where, you know, Chicago, because of how big Michael Jordan is, I feel like people like to just say, well, it was Jordan. It didn't matter who the coach was. Jordan was there. They were going to win. And so the impacts are looked at differently throughout history. But think about the Spurs Dynasty. Greg Popovich is all over. Like, we know about Tim Duncan. We know about Ginobili. We know about Parker, David Robinson, all the people who have played in San Antonio. But everybody knew year after year after year, Greg Popovich's coaching was one of the main reasons why they were good year after year after year. The system and the culture that he implemented is the reason they were good year after year after year. That's why Greg Popovich is considered one of the greatest coaches of all times. Because of that. His impact, you saw, was felt with them. But truly, you saw the impact that Greg Popovich had. And I think that's why you see people talk about what he did and their run after 22 decades of not making the playoffs straight. You don't do that having 5 different coaches. You make the playoffs for 20 years straight, you probably had one coach. And that means that coach must be doing a really good job to be making the playoffs for 20 years straight. Like, really? So, for me, I think coaching is all dependent upon the team. I feel like with the super team in Golden State, you didn't need to have necessarily the greatest coach because the talent was so much better. If you just had a competent coach, you would be fine. But think about the team. Think about if the league was very even at the top. There were just 5-6 teams you thought could win the championship. Sometimes the difference would be coaching. Where if you had Phil Jackson and Greg Popovich and then you had 2 lower level coaches, but they all had great quality teams with the same talent level, you're going to favor the teams with the coaches for a reason with Greg and Phil. Because you know about their coaching prowess. I always talk about this. Doc Rivers, to me, is one of the most interesting coaches to speak on this subject because he won a championship in Boston. They had the big 3, Ray Allen, KG, Paul Pierce. Went to the Clippers, had the Lob City. We have judged Greg Popovich on Doc Rivers on championship expectations. He only won one chip during all this, the last 14 years. He's only won one championship, which was his first year with the big 3 in Boston. And so people wonder, is he an elite coach? Is he just a good coach? Is he really overrated as a coach? And to me, we always sometimes like to say, you'll see how good a coach really is when he doesn't have the best players. Remember, 2 years ago, he took a KD-led Golden State Warriors to 6 games. That team had an identity, and he had to have one of his best coaching jobs to make sure the team was going to play as hard as they did and play the way they did night after night. And then you see when you get stars, his coaching changed. The way he coached changed on that team, and that's what I feel like loosened the screws in the Clippers, which then allowed them to be eliminated the way they were eliminated. Sometimes stars can actually diminish a coach, but not in a good way. So as a coach, you have to learn how to still establish your message and still establish your ideology with the team to then still push forward. See, Frank Vogel, I think, really fit with the Lakers because Frank Vogel was not a bad coach. We forget what he did with Roy Hibbert. He made Roy Hibbert an all-star. He had Paul George, Lance. He made that work. They made it to the playoffs, top seeds, all of that. Indiana was not the most talented roster you've ever seen. So, and he won with that. We don't think about Frank Vogel in that way, but he's a good coach. He's not elite, but he's good. So when the Lakers got him, people said, oh, they couldn't get who they wanted. Jason Kidd's going to surpass him, yada, yada, yada. But people forget, why would they, if Frank Vogel winning championships, why are you just going to replace him? Frank Vogel made adjustments during the playoffs. Each game, if the Lakers won, he made adjustments. He made a change to the last starting line. He made a change to the system. He made a change to what they were doing. Because he knew he had to change to be able to be competitive and to not allow what happened the previous game to happen. Because he could have been that guy who said, okay, yeah, they got us this game. I'm going to do the exact same thing next game, and we're going to execute better. We'll be fine. But no, he said, let me make the changes that are needed now. We're going to look at film. We're going to see where we need to make our changes, see what we need to attack, make that change, and then execute. That's why the Lakers would come out playing a different style after they would lose in the playoffs, and that's why they would go on to beat teams 4 straight. Because you have to have that type of coaching. Average coaches don't do that. Good coaches do. They make adjustments. Frank Vogel is very underrated in my opinion as a coach. Because some of the decisions that he made put the Lakers in the positions they were in to be successful and to win the championship this past year. And so, to me, in that situation, you kind of saw how important the coach was. Eric Spoelstra, too, on his end. Sometimes you have all those different players that you can play in the pieces that you have. You have to sometimes make adjustments with what Eric Spoelstra did. Remember, Eric Spoelstra, everybody said he was a good coach when Miami was making the 8th seed because people felt like he really didn't have a good roster. He didn't have a lot of talent in an aging Dwayne Wade and still was able to make 8th seeds and make the playoffs. Now, people may say, okay, he's in the Eastern Conference, but he was still able to make it regardless. He still fielded a very competitive team. And then the culture that Miami has is just enticing to players, which is why when they were able to get a Jimmy Butler and the talent they have, now they're like, okay, we can now get a big fish now to come to Miami because Eric Spoelstra is looked at and respected as one of the better coaches in the league. So, for me, coaching can play a big part in the success of a team. Like I said, there's not many KD-led Golden State Warrior teams out there where it's just like you probably can just put any coach in there and they'll be fine. Because when you have a league where you have teams that are kind of all stacking up to show who the best is, sometimes coaching can be the difference between you winning and losing games. It's not even the stars. It's not even the bench. It's how the coach uses the pieces, uses what he has, his strategy, his ideology, and how does he make adjustments to it when playing against a certain person, playing against a certain team, and executing it in a way that will put them in the best situation, in the best position to win games. That's what I think is going to separate a good coach from a bad coach, you know? Because if you don't have a coach who can do that, sometimes you'll always be stuck in this place where it's just like, dang, we can't break through. It feels like we're never getting that right puzzle. And finding the right coach is hard. Sometimes a coach is a good coach, but he's not maybe the most creative offensive coach. And then the offense is limited. And then your offense is not that good. And now you got to make a more offensive coach. But then you get a more offensive coach. And then his defense is kind of lacking. So the defense starts to lack. It's hard to find a coach where the offense and defense can, and people can sit here and say, well, he's doing everything he can, what he has, and making the most out of it. That was one of the reasons why Nick McMillan was let go in Indiana. People, remember, I still remember when Indiana got eliminated, I saw people on Indiana Twitter from the Indiana basketball pages saying, it's just offensively, there's not enough creativity, there's not enough movement. He's good, but he's not good enough if we really want to be a better team, which is why Indiana made the change they made. Sometimes it's hard to find that guy where you just feel like he's doing his part, we just ain't got the players. Now, we can sit here and say Indiana don't have the players to win a championship, but the fact that they're getting swept every year, some of that has to be on the coach. Because you would feel like, especially because you're thinking you can't win a game off these teams in the first round. I think that's kind of where a lot of those issues kind of lie with coaching. But coaching can definitely be a huge part of the success of a team if given the right coach in the right situations and the right set of circumstances. And that's all the time we have here for this segment. Coming up next, don't worry, I got you covered. We're going to get into some NBA news and rumors right here on the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Stay tuned.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment we discussed coaching, how important coaching is to the dynamic. We talked about stars and their impact and how it's different in every situation. We talked about bench, how I think that could be the backbone sometimes of a team that wins a championship, unless they're like super top heavy. And also, we talked about coaching and how important coaching is when it comes down to the success of a team, either or. And before we get into the news and rumors for this segment, I'd like you guys to please don't forget to subscribe or leave a review wherever platform you're listening to us on the GSMC Basketball Podcast. We definitely appreciate it, and we definitely love to hear from you as well. But as you know, I got to get into my basketball news and rumors. Like I said, this is a very, very discussional, talk-heavy topic, the last three segments. But, now we're going to get into some stuff that actually is happening in current events in the world of the Basketball Association of the NBA. So first rumor I want to get into. So obviously the draft is coming up very soon, I believe in a couple of weeks, if not next week. I want to say I think it's next week when the draft is. And so there's been questions about who would go number one if Minnesota did not trade out. Well, they're saying that overall, it looks like the number one pick in the draft would be LaMelo Ball. That seems to be the move that would be made here. And also, it was also brought into it that potentially whoever trades up to number one would also probably be getting LaMelo Ball. This is what ESPN's Jonathan Gilroy said Monday, talking about Ball being the prospective favorite to the top overall pick. And I quote, "Unless a surprise trade completely disrupts the top of the draft, LaMelo Ball, Anthony Edwards, and James Wiseman are likely to make up the top three in some order. According to conversations with multiple teams, scouts, and agents, most NBA front offices are operating under the assumption that Ball is going number one, either to Minnesota or a team that trades up to select him." This has been a question. Who would Minnesota go if people felt like Anthony Edwards would be in this spot because they feel like in terms of a fit, in terms of need, and obviously because Anthony Edwards is a top player, they would go Anthony Edwards. Because the LaMelo Ball dynamic would be interesting with D'Angelo Russell. Are they willing to go a D'Lo, LaMelo Ball backcourt? The basketball today is more positionless basketball. So that is something that definitely is possible among the ranks of the basketball world. And yet, it always feels like in the NBA draft, you hear it all the time. At the top of the draft especially, it doesn't matter what position you are. If you are the best player in the draft, you take them. Even if you don't need it. Even if you have plenty of them. You have plenty of point guards, plenty of shooting guards, plenty of big men. If there's a top player that's supposed to be a star and you don't have another star in that spot, you're just like, we're taking him. And this may be another example of that because if Minnesota doesn't trade out, they probably feel like on their draft board, LaMelo Ball is the best player available. And it would be kind of weird for us to not go with our best player available because of need. You don't draft number one because of need because you usually have plenty of needs. Now, the NBA is a little different because of the lottery, but, you usually draft based on who we just usually there's a great player up available and you have a lot of needs and it's probably going to be one of the places you have a need. So, would not be surprised if LaMelo Ball does go number one. And I think he should go number one. Now, also, we want to talk about Anthony Edwards. Now, Anthony Edwards had a televised pro day. And the report coming out of that pro day is that a lot of teams were discouraged by his workout. They were not very impressed with his workout. Jonathan Gilroy also said, and I quote, talking about Edwards' pro day, "Multiple front offices were somewhat discouraged watching Edward because of his sluggishness and inconsistencies with his jump shot." And that some people are actually worried that the potential that he has, a lot of people think that there's a low likelihood that he'll even reach it or even scratch the surface of that potential. And the pro day didn't help. Now, it won't affect his draft stock in terms of if someone's going to draft him high or if someone's going to draft him low. But it does definitely make teams probably sit there and think, okay, if we draft him, honestly, people haven't mentioned this. People may look at him and think this may be another Andrew Wiggins. Remember, Andrew Wiggins came out of there, best player in the draft. He had the potential to be a star in the league. And then he's good, but he never broke through to stardom. It's like he just was good. He was good, and then he just stayed good. But you're coming out of college, entering the NBA. If you're good, you're expecting to make the jump to great. Either you're great, maybe you stay good or an average role player, or you go down and, you become a bust. And Andrew Wiggins just kind of stayed the same. And we've heard discussions about his work ethic. He doesn't really work on his game a lot. A lot of people question his passion and desire for the game of basketball, if he even loves it. And this could be, Anthony Edwards could be another Andrew Wiggins, where he'll be fine, he'll play well, but he'll never reach the potential you would look at a guy like him and say, well, he clearly should be this because of the talent he possesses. And I think if you're a team drafting in that top 3 spot, you definitely probably don't want that to be the case. So we're going to have to see about that. I mean, we're really going to have to see. We're also going to talk about Devin Booker. There's been reports on Devin Booker that he may want out of Phoenix. But then there's also been conflicting reports that have said, well, no, Devin Booker's happy in Phoenix. He looks at the bubble, thinks we went 8-0 in the bubble, and we look like we're starting to become the team we think we can be, and so he wants to stay. Now, this all started with Brian Russillo when he stated on the Bill Simmons podcast that it's the worst kept secret that Booker wants to leave. And then a league source later told Hoopie's hype, Michael Scalado, that there's no truth to Booker's supposedly desire for an exit, and also because of the fact that he's getting paid a lot of money. Now, you would think, well, they're not playing on maybe the greatest team ever, and think, okay, yeah, I mean, you would understand it if it was for winning purposes. But at the same time, if I'm Devin Booker, I personally wouldn't leave. I personally wouldn't, because after what you saw at the end of last year, I think there's some hope there. There's some, you kind of look at it and think, Monty Williams was hired, the team played defense. Now remember, DeAndre Ayton, it's the same thing that happened with the Hawks in the East. Their 2-star big men both got suspended for 25 games, and that's when the Suns' season started to derail. And then it derailed so much that by the time he got back, it was kind of too late to really make another run to get back. And then everything. And then when the bubble came back around, everybody was healthy, everybody was ready to go, and you saw what happened. And so, you got some talent, Mikal Bridges, Cameron Johnson, Kelly Oubre. We forget he had 19 points a game this year. He was hurt in the bubble. You got DeAndre Ayton, one of your 2 center round players with Devin Booker. They have some talent. They have improvement. And Monty Williams is a guy I think who's going to get them back. And remember, they have the 10th pick in this draft. And I think Booker, should do his due diligence and look and try to see, okay, what are we going to do this year? Short season, clearly. But this year, 72 games, Kelly Oubre come back. I'm here. Ayton, Rubio, everybody. Let's see how we do. If no major, injuries are going to happen. No major injuries to key players. No suspensions. And see how good of a team we are throughout the season. I think that's going to be the big thing here. I think that's going to be what can make the difference between a team being a really good team and a team not being. Because, the Suns have been looking to break through for a while. And the Western Conference is a very stacked conference. I feel like one team this year we expect to be good is going to fall off for a new team. Somebody is. The teams that you saw last year, I don't think one of them is going to fall. Now, right now, a lot of people think that's going to be Houston based off the direction they take with the franchise. But we gotta stay tuned. We gotta keep an eye on it, and we have to see what happens. But I think Devin Booker should definitely stay, and he should be a part of that and see what happens. And then we're gonna get into some news on the season. So NBA health officials are reportedly concerned with the short offseason for players because they're worried about injuries. Injuries is obviously the biggest thing with this short start. A lot of people are worried that the players may not respond well physically. Especially, again, for the playoff teams. Don't be surprised, even though we hope this, if the Lakers suffer a lot of injuries early in the season. And the Clippers and maybe the Heat, they suffer a lot of injuries early because they weren't able to give themselves enough time to really get that break that they needed to get ready for the next season. So I would not be surprised if that was something that would happen. And so the health officials are worried, again, that injuries are going to ramp up. And also, we got to remember, the NBA, when the season comes back, they're going to try to play it like a normal season. So travel. Remember, when you're trying to recover, traveling isn't really a time where you can recover. And some people say it can actually be a detriment to your health sometimes. The bubble helped because you didn't have to travel. You could literally go from the game and recover. Start recovery instantly till the next time you had to play. Well, think about it. You may have a back-to-back. You're a little banged up. You got to travel through the night. You got to get to the hotel room. You got to get adjusted. Then you got to get some sleep. Then you got to wake up. Then you work on getting recovery. Now you're not getting as much recovery as you could have had if you were able to just recover from the game ending the previous night. And that sometimes has helped. And so with that, with the reduced travel, with the short ramp up period, injuries could potentially be a big deal this season, and the NBA has to be careful about this. You saw with the NFL, a lot of soft tissue injuries, a lot of injuries happening this year because of the fact that, you didn't really have a chance to really work out and get yourself in shape with the team, and now you might see that with basketball. With this short ramp-up period, you might see a lot of injuries because players just don't have enough time to recover. Now, obviously, teams that haven't played in over 8 months may be in a better place because they've had plenty of time to rest their bodies. But it's the teams that have played a little bit later into the seasons, like I would say probably Western Conference, Eastern Conference Finals teams and NBA Finals teams are most at risk. Semifinals, maybe. First round, I think you're still good. And if you were eliminated after the bubble ended, you should be fine to me. Because the season, I believe, ended in October for you. And so then you would have had till December, so that's about 4 months. If the season ends usually in June if you play in the finals, and then you play all the way to October, that's about 4 months. So if you were ended from April, it's about 6. But it's still close enough time for you to be okay. So we're going to have to see what happens with that. Hopefully we don't see a lot of injuries this year when the season comes back, and we're going to hope for the best. But that's all the time we have here for the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Thank you for tuning in once again. Thank you for letting me be part of your day. This is your host, Brice Lewis, saying, I hope you all have a good day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.